Thank you. A huge welcome to everyone, and thank you for coming this afternoon. I'm delighted to be joining all of you here for this year's Harri Holkeri Lecture. First, I'd like to extend a special welcome to our guest speaker, Pekka Haavisto, MP, who is the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Finland, who will be speaking to us today about the lessons learned from his country's road to NATO. And as this is very regionally topical, I'm sure this is going to be very interesting and challenging. And we're very honoured, Pekka, that you've joined us today to give this important lecture. I also want to welcome add a welcome to the Ambassador of Finland to the UK, Jukka Sukasaari, Ambassador of Finland to Ireland, Lina Gardemister, and we're delighted that they're here joining us in these islands and co-hosting this event today. In my role as Provost of Queen's and on behalf of the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice, I'm delighted to welcome everyone to the Annual Harri Holkeri Lecture in honour of the late former Prime Minister of Finland, who contributed a great deal to the peace process here in Northern Ireland. And indeed, being a child of the Troubles, I do remember his contribution. Prime Minister Holkeri's work in transforming conflict and promoting social justice in Northern Ireland has indeed, he did also across the world, is a mission which is shared by the Mitchell Institute. And indeed, I think we are reminded with the remembrance over the past 48 hours of the D-Day landings and other past, present and likely future wars, of the importance of conflict resolution in our world. Many times I think we've wondered, are we at a place where we're mature enough as a race to sort these things out? But clearly we're not, and conflict resolution and peace building was something that we need to have skilled and wise people leading, such as Harri did. As I've said, it's our honour to partner with the Embassy of Finland in London to host this lecture and to also have the Ambassador for Dublin. This evening marks the 9th in a series of lectures honouring Harri's contribution and is a true highlight of the University and Mitchell Institute's calendar for the year. As many of you joining us here today will know, Queen's University Belfast has been a constant and stable presence for almost 180 years. We celebrate that with the other 2 Queen's colleges next year. And that's seen through major challenges on these islands, from famine to seismic political, constitutional and societal changes. And as a university, we have made a major contribution to Belfast, to all of the island as an anchor institution in the development of this city, this island and its people. Through world-class teaching, which is still helping to create the next generation of leaders, and through our world-leading research, which changes the lives of people every day, including the work, the world-class work that comes from the Mitchell Institute, bringing researchers together on a scale that enables them to tackle some of the global challenges of our time. Our colleagues in the Institute, through their efforts in research, education and civic engagement, make a difference to the lives of ordinary people who are struggling in the aftermath of conflict by empowering them to realise fairness, justice and tolerance, not just here in Northern Ireland, but in many of the difficult conflict situations across the globe. The local impact of this was actually demonstrated remarkably in an event earlier today where we celebrated our role as a civic anchor university and highlighted the local impact in our local communities, which is still so important, working in cross-community situations that are associated with high levels of deprivation, and working to empower those communities to change for the better, not by imposing solutions, but by understanding, working with those communities and co-creating ways in which they can change as a community and improve, for example, access to further and higher education for their children. Queen's has always been an important place for this community, and I think is learning also now to embrace the wonderful and increasing diversity we are seeing within Belfast and wider ways across the island. Queen's has been a key arena for safe and challenging political debate, and I again remember this at my time at Queen's, where there was that sense of safety and an ability to talk across areas that were very challenging at the time, because the conflict was still going strongly during the late 1970s, when I had the privilege of being here. And Northern Ireland has had challenges with our politicians, but we do have to take responsibility for some of that, because many of those leaders have trained at Queen's, have studied in subjects related to the Mitchell Institute, and we remain committed to training, upskilling and empowering our politicians to be leaders within this post-conflict community, to lead us into better places. So moving on to tonight's esteemed speaker, we are really delighted to be hearing from Pekka for this lecture tonight. Pekka's political career began in 1987 as a member of Parliament of Finland, and he served as Minister of the Environment between 1995 and 1990, making history as the first ever European Cabinet Minister representing the Green Party. He's especially experienced in foreign policy and international operations, and from 1999 to 2005, he led research into the environmental impact of war and has represented the EU and UN in various crises across the world. He later returned to politics to serve as Foreign Minister of Finland from 2019 to 2023. He's had an illustrious career dedicated to helping others across Europe and beyond, and is a proven and seasoned peace negotiator and defender of both democracy and human rights. And we're delighted and honoured to be having him deliver tonight's Harri Holkeri Lecture. So now it's my pleasure to invite Pekka to come to the front and deliver his lecture, The New European Security, Lessons Learned from Finland's Road to NATO. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor, for your nice words, and professors and Professor England, ambassadors, dear audience. Nice to be here in Belfast, and particularly interesting to talk and discuss with you about the topic that is so acute of today. And of course, I want to also praise the work that Professor England has been doing during his career as a researcher of recent political history, and especially has been teaching us so much about the process in the Northern Ireland and all those experiences. And of course, Harri Holkeri is well remembered as a Finnish Prime Minister, but also for the work that he did here in Ireland. And this is great to be in this series of the lectures honoring and commemorating the Good Friday Agreement 26 years ago, signed after long negotiations on the 10th of April 1998. Finland had a central role in both the negotiations and the implementation of the agreement. The former Finnish Prime Minister Holkeri worked in 1995-98 with a group chaired by Senator George Mitchell, first laying the foundations for peace negotiations with recommendations and later on acting as the chair committee for the mediation process. In addition, the Finnish President Martti Ahtisaari co-chaired the Independent International Commission on Decommissioning and oversaw the decommission of the IRA in 2000-2001. Let us today honor the invaluable work of everyone taking part in this important and successful peace process. The topic of my lecture today is the new European security, lessons learned from Finland's road to NATO. I was Finland's Minister for Foreign Affairs 2019-2023 when we quickly started the process for NATO accession. It began in the spring of 2022, prompted by the February 24th Russian war of aggression in Ukraine, as well as the Russian President Vladimir Putin's earlier speeches of Russia never accepting the enlargement of NATO, speeches that he gave, for example, in December 2021. Finland has been the only country in the world maintaining for a long time the so-called NATO option. It was for the first time defined in the program of Prime Minister Paavo Lipponen's government in 1995. Since then, the option has been a guarantee of sorts of the Finnish independence to consider joining NATO should the geopolitical situation so require. It's hard to imagine a greater shift in our geopolitical landscape than our neighbor Russia waging a war of aggression against a fellow European state, Ukraine. Thus, February 22 set in motion two things: immediate military assistance to Ukraine and the beginning of Finland's accession process to NATO. Our assistance to Ukraine is in accord with the UN's Charter, Article 51. Quote, "Nothing in the present Charter shall impair the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations until the Security Council has taken measures necessary to maintain international peace and security." Quote finishing. Ukraine has every right to defend itself, and we have every right to help her defend herself until the UN Security Council takes action for international peace and security. Such action is yet to be seen or heard. While the Security Council stays paralyzed due to the veto power of the Permanent Five, moral leadership has been shown by the General Assembly. The Assembly, overwhelmingly 141 votes against 7, voted for Russia to withdraw its troops from Ukraine immediately in February 23. In the past, Finland was often referred to as a non-allied or neutral country. In our view, Finland resigned her neutrality in its traditional sense in 1995 when we joined the European Union, and military non-allied position during the NATO accession in February 23. While some of the NATO member states think that the NATO response dismisses the need for the development of a common EU defence, we in Finland view this matter differently. The Article 42.7 of the Treaty of Lisbon from 2009 and the fifth article of the North Atlantic Treaty are, in their nature, not altogether dissimilar. The former requires every EU member state to offer assistance by all means necessary and available should any member be the victim of an attack. The latter, the NATO clause, on the other hand, binds the USA to European defence ever since the Cold War. Why then does the Article 42.7 seem so flimsy, especially when compared to the fifth article of NATO? Why do the European security guarantees feel inadequate? My analysis is that this feeling derives from the lack of structures behind the EU article. There are no European command structures, no executing actors, no common practices, no plans. It's very interesting then that the main discourse of the ongoing European parliamentary elections and the expected agenda of the Commission to be is in fact security and defence. This would be a shift from the strategic and geopolitical stance of the current Commission. If this means the strengthening of European defence, development of crisis management efforts, comprehensive security, increasing cooperation between military and civil actors, I think it's a change worth making. However, military cooperation will not compensate or replace what can be achieved through common European foreign policy. In the beginning, I reflected upon some of the security policy contexts which surrounded Finland's road to NATO. Of course, we did follow events other than just Russian aggression towards Ukraine. Finland has always valued its cooperation in the Arctic region. In January 22, we took note that one of the underwater telecommunication cables from Svalsat, the largest satellite station in the world, situated in Svalbard, Norway, was broken. Suspicious activity and movement was also recorded near the cables leading from Ireland to the USA. A textbook example of modern cyber and hybrid threats, which can often be used against telecommunications and important data connections. Hybrid threats can also affect energy infrastructure. In September 22, the Nord Stream gas pipe was blown up in the Baltic Sea. In October 23, the Baltic Connector gas pipe between Estonia and Finland was damaged, along with some telecommunication cables. The jamming of GPS signals to hinder air traffic, among other things, is also one of the ways how the Russian aggression against Ukraine has become visible to us. The Russian war in Ukraine, along with the rise of geopolitical tensions in Europe, has become closer and closer to us due to these events. It draws before us a new picture of warfare, simultaneously a replica of the horrors in the trenches of the First and Second World Wars, and a modern compilation of cyber and hybrid warfare. The terror of landmines is now accompanied with the terror of drones, a silent yet effective attack from the heavens. Instead of single drones, we will soon see swarms of drones at war theaters. During times of great change, it's sometimes worthwhile to leaf through old newspapers and magazines. By chance, I found an issue of Foreign Affairs from 1999, the year of the Kosovo War, featuring a somewhat disturbing title, "Give War a Chance." The article was written by Edward Luttwak, and it warns against premature and careless peace efforts that could hinder the cause of war. The idea he presents is that war always ends in peace, one way or another, and when war takes its natural course and time, the resulting peace will be more sustainable. As a firm believer and an advocate of peace efforts and mediation, I of course found the title and the idea very provocative. But however disturbing, it does reflect the times we are living in and the events unfolding around us. The world is looking for military solutions, not for negotiations. The Taliban walkover in Afghanistan, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, the Israeli offensive in Gaza, Ethiopian forces in Tigray, Russian war of aggression in Ukraine, just to mention some examples. Wherever we look, we find military rhetorics dominating the discourse. Some go as far as to say that even though the diplomats are alive, diplomacy itself is dead. Sorry, ambassadors. But is this the case? Is diplomacy dead, or is it just more invisible than before? We know very little of the communication between Iran and the USA, only that some communications might exist. We sometimes hear that prisoners of war have been exchanged between Russia and Ukraine, news of the Black Sea Initiative securing grain exports to combat famine in Africa. We see the results of the IAEA shuttle diplomacy on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to work for nuclear safety in the most dangerous situations. These are examples of the work diplomats are doing today. My experience deriving from acting as the EU Special Representative in Sudan and Darfur and in other peace mediation efforts is that during a conflict, communication between the different parties is vital, not least in order to prevent any excessive violence. As the Special Representative, I had the habit of calling the various paramilitary and guerrilla groups early in the mornings. A typical call included a strong message. If the human rights violations should continue, instead of sitting in government cabinets in the future, the leaders would find themselves in the International Criminal Court. Sometimes this warning was even enough. Finland has a strong history of peace mediation. What then could be the role of Finland as a NATO member in peace mediation? Will it change due to the membership? Of course, it will change Finland's role in any conflict, where either NATO or the EU is viewed as a party. But in the majority of conflicts, Finland could still be an active supporter of mediation or even a mediator. As an example, we might look towards Norway or even towards Turkey in some cases. Both are NATO members, and yet both have their own profile in peacemaking and mediation. Norway has a prominent role in the mediation processes in the Middle East, and Turkey, on the other hand, has hosted the talks in Istanbul in order to bring an armistice between Russia and Ukraine. Let me turn back to the year 2022. Before the beginning of the Russian war of aggression, the world followed with dismay the gathering of Russian and Belarusian troops near the Ukrainian border. Russia, of course, claimed this was merely an exercise. The intelligence of both the USA and the UK was, however, determined that it was rather a mobilization than an exercise. On the other hand, Ukraine believed, at least publicly, this to be theater on the Russian part. Therefore, Ukraine didn't mobilize until offensive began on 24th of February, and during the first few days there was a serious question of whether the Russian army could take over Kyiv and collapse the government. It couldn't. This is a pivotal moment. Russia was unable to repeat the success of its takeover in the Crimea in 2014. Ukraine was able to stop the offensive and from a battlefront for the West to arm and support. As Finland's Minister for Foreign Affairs, there was an interesting appointment in January 22. Then the then Secretary of State of Defense, Ben Wallis, visited Finland. During lunch, he surprised me by asking what kind of security guarantees Finland would require. This happened before the war began, before Finland decided to join NATO. My answer was very cautious that time, but later that spring, we were in fact happy to accept security guarantees from not only the United Kingdom, but several NATO member states. It was important for us and for our application to be processed quickly, and during any interim period, we would not want to face the possible unfriendly reactions alone. We had scenarios for interference on land, air, and sea, as well as for various cyber and hybrid threats. When we began our first discussions with NATO member states in order to ascertain whether the Finnish accession would receive sufficient support, many still believed that the war wouldn't last for long. Many believed that some negotiations would soon take over the fighting. Turkey began the Istanbul talks, and several of the NATO members worried over the risk of escalating due to the potential NATO enlargement. For us in Finland, it was a priority not to join NATO alone, but with Sweden. However, our first calls to Stockholm were not entirely successful. The Swedes emphasized their 200-year-long neutrality and the ability to avoid conflict, such as the Second World War. Finland and Sweden's road to NATO was a quick one in the beginning, with member state after another ratifying the accession. There were, however, two exceptions, Turkey and Hungary. With Turkey, the question was primarily domestic. The EU was accused of protecting Kurdish groups labeled by Turkey as terrorist organizations. Both Finland and Sweden were seen as refugees for these groups. Hungary, on the other hand, had a bone to pick with the countries that had voiced concerns over human rights issues or the rule of law in Hungary. During the Madrid summit in the summer 22, a trilateral group between Turkey, Sweden and Finland was established in order to resolve the issues presented by Turkey. Hungary announced that she would not be the last country to ratify the accession, and in a way gave Turkey a mandatum to find a solution to the question. The trilateral negotiations were not easy. In the beginning of 23, several Qurans were burned in Stockholm, and puppet dressed as President Erdogan was hanged in Sweden. For a while it seemed like a road to NATO had faced a dead end. At the same time, we faced our difficulties in negotiations with Hungary in both Helsinki and Budapest. Maybe I address these with two examples. First, in our discussions with the Hungarian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Peter Szijjártó, he raised an issue that Hungary has always been left alone in the end. And that is why they are so suspicious to all international agreements. And it sounded very much like Finland, because Finns sometimes have the rhetoric that we were also left alone during the Winter War 39-40. And I asked from Peter Siarto, when was the last time that you were left alone as Hungary? When were you abandoned? And he referred to Hungarian uprising in 1956, when the Hungarian people first rallied to the barricades where the Western support was backing them, so they thought, but when the Soviet tanks arrived, no support continued. I actually responded by remembering that I have been looking from the Finnish TV archives some spots from those years when Finnish citizens collected money for Hungary, for solidarity, 1956 at the key places in Helsinki. And the Hungarian minister was really surprised. He said that weren't you behind the Iron Curtain? It was only a little bit more than 10 years after the war ended and so forth. And for him it was a surprise that there, at least in countries like Finland, had been such a strong solidarity movement. Then he changed the topic and he said he's concerned about the Hungarian-speaking minority in the Western Ukraine. When you are supporting Ukraine to become a member of European Union, can you guarantee that the Hungarian people's linguistic rights are guaranteed in European Union, also on the territory of Ukraine? Again, I, of course, didn't have a direct answer, but I said, come to Finland, look what we have done. We have our Swedish-speaking minority rights, we have our Sami-speaking minority rights, all in the constitution. That's our attitude to the minority languages. So I'm guessing that when comes today, when Ukraine is part of the European Union, we can also preserve the minority linguistic rights. These were the discussions. One by one, we tackled some of the concerns of our Hungarian friends. In the end, Finland and Sweden could not join NATO at the same time. Finland became a member in the late spring 23, and Sweden only in 2024. But all's well that ends well. Diplomacy was not quite dead after all. What kind of NATO member will Finland become? Many people in Finland see NATO as a purely military organization. It is that too, but it is also an organization of diplomats, of comprehensive security, compiling a myriad of different branches of government. In the corridors and conference rooms, one can hear talk of climate catastrophe and its effects, of women's rights and their role in crisis management, new types of hybrid and cyber threats to our societies. I believe that it's Finland's mission to further this discussion within NATO, to bring these topics and other topics into the main agenda of security and crisis management policies. We must understand that even though small countries like Finland prepare for the worst, there is no better remedy for this conflict-ridden world than diplomacy. There is no better tool for conflict prevention and resolution than mediation. And we cannot let diplomacy die. It's painful to admit that the UN, the very organization which was forged in the flames of the Second World War and meant to solve conflicts through diplomatic efforts, is now more or less paralyzed. Not the whole UN, but the Security Council, where the permanent 5 nuclear powers can freely exercise their veto. The Security Council is supposed to be the normative legislative body in the global system. When it fails to function, the role of the UN is narrowed down to the moral compass of the General Assembly, accompanied by the massive apparatus built to coordinate and deliver humanitarian and development aid. Do not misunderstand me, this is all needed, but we also need the hardcore of the United Nations. Finland is once again running to become a member of the Security Council in 2028. It's important that we, together with other like-minded countries, enter the debate of the required reforms to the UN. Time and time again, the suggestion to replace the UN with another organization, for example, a Union of Democratic Countries, perhaps presents itself. That would mean an organization which would exclude countries like Afghanistan, Iran or Cuba, but that, at least in my mind, is the very strength of the UN, the ability to gather everyone around the same table. We need an organization capable of bringing states together in resolving conflicts, but also in battling climate catastrophe and the collapse of ecosystems. Not all problems can be solved amongst the like-minded. The question of war and peace will be central in the future of our generation and in the future of humanity itself. We live in times where casual talk of conflict, even of nuclear weapons in conflict, is commonplace. I return to the statement that even though diplomats are alive and well, diplomacy itself is dead. This must not be. I have met mediators from the Middle East frowning at the moment in despair of the immense difficulty in confidence building between conflicting parties, or how the parties don't see peace as an option, even though a ceasefire is achieved or hostages are released. We all have a responsibility towards peace in the Middle East. We all must take the first steps together. I know that the debate of the Palestinian state, of the two-state solution, is heated at the moment. Previously, I thought that the recognition of Palestine should be done in accord with the peace negotiations. I have, however, changed my mind. In the current situation, the Palestinians should be given the opportunity to defend themselves and their citizens in the UN as well as in the international courts. It's impossible to accept that an occupational power could represent them. The collective awareness of the world can recognize only up to 2 conflicts at a time. That is why I won't speak to you today of Afghanistan or Syria, Yemen, Sudan, Sahel or Venezuela, but I will return for a moment to the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine. While the conflict goes on, some negotiations have still taken place. First in the spring of 22 in Istanbul, hosted by Turkey. After that, talks on the exchange of prisoners, security in the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and grain export routes in the Black Sea. In the middle of June, in the Peace Summit in Switzerland, these issues will probably dominate the discussion, along with the question of the safe homecoming of the kidnapped children. When looking at the war theater, all these diplomatic efforts seem to be minor ones. But one has to begin somewhere. We need a just peace, but we also need confidence-building measures, sometimes even baby steps. In the beginning of this lecture, I reminded us all of the invaluable peace mediation efforts of Harri Holkeri and President Martti Ahtisaari in Northern Ireland and in other parts of the world as well. I believe that there still is a part of the Finnish DNA which entails the passion of and the expertise to actively support peace processes. This is true at the government level as well as in our civil society. When you look at the world around us, we see not only the reality of war, but also the rhetoric of war taking over the media and the public space. But deep inside, we know still that the ordinary people in all societies value peace and prosperity above all. All religions pray for peace. All mothers and fathers hope for their children to live in a world of peace. And I believe that here in Northern Ireland, today, here in Belfast, out of all places, you will give peace the value and recognition it deserves. Thank you.
Pekka, Haavisto, thank you very much indeed for that wide-ranging and very powerful lecture. We now move to the opportunity for there to be questions. We're going to begin with a few follow-up questions from me as director of the Mitchell Institute, and I'll ask Pekka a few questions based on his compelling lecture, and then we'll move to questions from you. So do please plan for that part of the discussion when we'll very much value hearing from you in terms of your questions and insights and responses. Pekka, I wanted to start by thinking about the kind of argument that ran through your lecture there about the need for not giving up on diplomacy, the importance of mediation. You're implying that people exaggerate what military methods can do and underestimate what can be done through mediation. And quite rightly and appropriately for this lecture, you talk very strongly about the Finnish contribution to peace building. if we start with Israel-Palestine, you say diplomacy is not quite dead. There's no better tool than mediation. And you say we need to take the first steps, even if they're baby steps. Could you say something, if you were to look at the ways in which there could be, as there was in Northern Ireland, a Finnish contribution to those first steps in regard to Israel-Palestine? I mean, things do seem very bleak now. On the other hand, if we'd been having this conversation in 1993, the Israel-Palestine peace process was going very well, and things were going atrociously badly here. And I remember hearing lectures from people saying peace will happen in Israel, but it could never happen here. And now the opposite is the orthodoxy. What would be some of the baby steps you would think it would be valuable for Finnish voices and others, perhaps including Northern Ireland and Irish voices, to speak about in terms of where we could go first?
Thank you. That's a good question. I was working in the UN for this post-conflict environmental analysis, and one of the issues that we did was the environmental analysis of occupied Palestinian territories. And to everyone's surprise, we could do that under the UN flag in UNEP, United Nations Environmental Organization, so that Israel also agreed. They threw me away a couple of times from the offices, but I always returned. And it was during the Second Intifada. And the Palestinians basically said that they are not allowed to cooperate at all with any exercise where Israelis are involved. And Israelis had almost the same reservation. And finally we got them first to sit in Geneva together and then in Finland together, talking about biodiversity, talking about the water resources, talking about toxic waste and clean up what is needed and toxic waste that is dumped here and there. And then that's actually led me to believe that we can have many kinds of peace-building tools, but as an example, the environmental component is always there. And it was actually supported by the Israeli population, by the Palestinian population close to the borderline, that something has to be done to these everyday problems and so forth. So it's always to find something to work with and something to try to start the discussions. But I, of course, also remember when we worked in Gaza at that time, it was, of course, before the 2005 elections and what then followed, where Palestinians always were saying us that things cannot get worse. And we were always saying, yes, they can get worse. So believe us that this can happen. And of course, it has becoming worse. And what's now when I'm meeting some of the people who are sitting in the same room of the negotiations, we know that Qatar and Egypt, for example, are running these talks. I can have the impression that both sides think that even if the hostages are released, or even if there is a ceasefire, somehow the conflict continues. And of course, this wishful thinking that Hamas would somehow disappear after such a bitter happenings. I call it wishful thinking because we know that these are generations will be influenced by this violence that is now happening. We cannot just wish away those kids and those youngsters who are under this process, and we just have to do whatever we can do now to avoid the worst consequences.
Thank you very much. Moving from a question about baby steps in the right direction, I suppose this next question has the danger, from my perspective, that I'm talking about something which maybe is moving things in the wrong direction, possibly. There'll be a US presidential election in November. The outcome at the moment doesn't seem at all clear, but if one of the people who's likely to be campaigning for the job gets the job, do you have concerns about the effects of that, not only on American engagement with NATO, but on the nature of NATO itself, given that you were talking in your lecture about trying to reimagine what NATO can do in a benign way?
Well, in the beginning of my foreign minister career, of course, that was still President Trump's time, and my colleague was Foreign Secretary Pompeo. And I have to say that all talks were really topical and good discussions with Pompeo, except the issue of the climate change and environment, which was no-go zone. And of course, when we had a discussion on Arctic issue, it's very difficult to talk about the Arctic without the climate change. But I was suffering, and somehow I felt that probably even he was personally suffering, but it was a no-go topic. And then I asked NATO Secretary General, for example, that how was it in NATO during the Trump time? And actually the answer was that US kept all its commitments, sent all the troops, sent all the money, even if the rhetoric was very hostile sometimes against, particularly against the European Union, as we remember, against Brussels, but also against the European NATO members. I'm not saying that this would lead that also the next period will be similar, but I think it's an interesting experience. But that's also the reason why I was mentioning the European Security Article 42.7 in the Lisbon Treaty, that I think we should develop and think about the European security seriously. We can have many scenarios for the future, but one scenario, of course, is that we see a United States that is more concentrated to its own issues or concentrated to some other conflicts in the world and not so much on the European security. And I think that's in our mindset. We have to be prepared for that as well.
This brings me on to the other point I wanted to pick up next in terms of what you said in your lecture, because you talked about the EU and security and about the need for a common European foreign policy and coherence there. As you know, here in Northern Ireland, we've been in the front row for the effects of Brexit in terms of the effects and outworkings of that decision by the UK majority in 2016. Could you say something about the way in which Brexit has or hasn't affected the prospects for the kind of European foreign policy you'd like? And again, bearing in mind there'll be a different kind of election very soon in the UK, which will have some effects possibly. But the UK's departure from the European Union and your idea of what foreign policy for Europe should involve, has it made a significant difference or not particularly in your view?
Well, of course, it was a major and dramatic change in first of all EU-UK relations, including our bilateral relations, because it's in everyday life, of course, the students that were planning to study in London or other locations and faced all these difficulties and so forth. It was a very, in that way, we felt it as a very negative step, of course, when we speak about the European cooperation. Then it was interesting to see how, after the Russia attack to Ukraine, somehow I had a feeling that UK is coming back, but from the back door, the security door, so to say, which was an important component as well in the whole cooperation, and that's probably still like that. It's easier to talk about security and defense issues and plan together what more we can do to support Ukraine and so forth. But that at least brings UK back to some of these tables and discussions. But I think, of course, we even without UK, we have this problem of the decision-making of the European foreign policy. We have 3 different opinions on Middle East in European Union, and it's a miracle that we had only one opinion on supporting of Ukraine. And it needed a lot of work, but that we could use the European Peace Facility to support Ukraine and so forth was very, very important. But of course, it's a shame that, for example, on the Middle East, we cannot coordinate our opinion because we are weaker in that sense. And for that reason, Finland has been supporting qualified majority decisions in foreign policy issues and finding a mechanism like consensus -1 or something like that countries cannot from their own purposes block decisions. And of course I mentioned the Hungary issue, which has been a painful issue also on the support of Ukraine.
Thank you, Pekka. One more question from me, and then we'll get to questions from the audience. So please do have those ready for when Pekka has answered my final question. You talked very movingly about the tragedy of the Russian aggression in Ukraine. You also mentioned that global attention, that most will tend to focus on 2 things. It's also true, I think, isn't it, that global attention doesn't have endless patience and people begin to lose interest and become wearied with things. Could you set out something of what you think, as things stand now, the best end game would be in regard to how Ukraine is resolved and how this comes to an end? I mean, you said there's wishful thinking people have about Hamas. There may be some wishful thinking people have had about Ukraine too, but what would be your sense of what a feasible end game might look like in terms of Ukraine so that there could move to be a more benign recalibration of relations and of human flourishing?
Well, first about these many conflicts that are overlapping all the time. If you ask people that what is the worst migration crisis or refugee crisis currently, very few people could maybe name Sudan or what's happening in Sudan, but that's unfortunately true, that the people who left Khartoum and other big locations, it's numerous people and leaving even the country at the moment. And I remember well the talks particularly with the Darfurian counterparts who were in the middle of this Hollywood attention at one moment. Richard Gere and everybody were very supportive to Darfur. So these people were thinking that this means that Darfur will always be topic number one, that they don't need to hurry in the negotiations because the whole world is concerned about Darfur. And I really had to warn them that, next week it's no more Darfur, it's something else. Use this opportunity when the pressure is there and the public opinion of the world is there. And many negotiators made this mistake during the Darfur crisis and certainly with many other crises as well. On Ukraine, it's very difficult to see, but I think it's actually quite interesting what this set of meetings based on President Zelensky's peace initiative could produce. And I can see already some development on the topics when the Swiss conference will be now in the mid of June. For example, these orphans and protection of children, where President Zelensky was also now referring that one, I think he says almost like that one part of the final peace should be that these issues are settled. So it's coming back to the real topics on the ground in many ways. But of course, at the moment we have to hope that our efforts are effective enough to push back Russia from those areas that it has been occupying. I had some weeks ago a discussion with a very, very experienced gentleman from Baltic states, and he almost said that way, don't worry, there is always the black swans coming. and these changed the war and the developments and so forth. And I have to say that last summer when we saw the Wagner leader almost marching to Moscow and so forth, I was thinking that this is the series of black swans appearing, and then something happens, and then something else happens, and we cannot control it so much. But this is one option, of course.
Thank you very much for that, as for your earlier excellent answers. Going to move now to questions from the audience. We have, I think, roving microphone, which will enable the question to be heard by everyone. So who'll start us off with the first question for Pekka Haavisto, please? Two questions here, so maybe if the microphone could come, Morris, to Katie first, and then thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a really fascinating discussion and lecture. My question follows on exactly from that topic you've just finished talking about, Ukraine. Increasingly thinking perhaps of Europe as being in a pre-war period, and if Ukraine does fall, that war with Russia is inevitable, is some of the discourse. I was wondering if that's the case, if our future selves are looking back on this period, will we regret more that we didn't invest more in diplomatic efforts or in putting Europe on a militarized footing?
Thanks, Katie.
Well, that's a good question, and of course I know that military people are thinking that okay, we can increase this and this much our military support to Ukraine, but what if, despite of all these efforts, it doesn't function or is not enough? How much there is left for us in all kind of negative scenarios? Where this could lead? And these are difficult, these military calculations. And then this is an answer why, when people are sometimes frustrated, that why don't you put 100% of your material and support and everything to Ukraine? You have to be aware and think all kinds of scenarios in the bottom. So black swans can work in too many directions. Did we do enough for the diplomacy? I think we sometimes might come back to this Minsk negotiation processes, which at the moment feel almost very soft, the positions of Europeans and international community that we're ready to negotiate and ready to go through these processes. Rhetoric is now totally different. But of course, countries like Germany and others invested a lot to those processes to take place and to continue. And then, of course, I still remember the moment, and it was autumn 2019 when I, with the Swedish foreign minister, visited Minsk, Belarus, and President Lukashenko. And it was not so clear where that was before elections, where he stole then the elections and so forth, but it was not very clear where he is heading to and where is his loyalty and where is his sympathy. And basically he played with the idea that he could increase the European cooperation and so forth. And he had a very lovely sentence to us, of course, coming from the Nordic country. He said, look, Belarus would like to be one of the Nordic countries. And we were a little bit shocked with the Swedish minister that how to respond to this. And then we said that you have introduced the death penalty. So why, if you start your way towards a Nordic country by cancelling the death penalty? We proposed to him, and then he said, no, we don't want to be so Nordic. So that was our debate with him. But I think when we go back, it's interesting, this diplomatic effort, including the issue that I referred to, Turkey's talks in Istanbul, spring 22, because there was a moment when maybe many countries in Europe were thinking that this is a shorter conflict, and maybe through some of these negotiated efforts it can be solved. But then came the Bucha, and then came the other issues that clearly prevented to coming to any conclusion.
Thank you. This question now, yes.
Yeah. Thank you for your illuminating lecture and talk. A lot of people would have said we're now in a post-human rights era with the amount of securitization and conflicts that are going on. And I was just wondering if you could reflect on that, because I think human rights is embedded in a lot of your lecture and your approach into diplomacy. And how can we all be active citizens in making sure we don't give up human rights when there's such security threats? And then a follow-up would be, you talked about Europe and securitization. What do you think a defence commissioner could do in operationalising those mechanisms in the different treaties you said?
Thank you.
Excellent question. And first about the human rights, as you maybe noticed that I didn't specially underline the issue of the human rights, and that's because I'm somehow always think that these are embedded in the peace processes, and these are embedded also into environmental issues during the war and so forth. But I think that we should make the reference also to these international courts at the moment, ICG and ICC, the very important work that they are doing, not only on the Middle East issues, but on the other issues. And when we in Europe always say that we are for the legal societies and rules-based order and so forth, I think it's very important that we support, particularly in these cases which are a little bit difficult to us, like the Israel-Palestine, that we support these international bodies and their work, and that they can do peacefully their work on these issues. That's not always so clear, but when something that is negative to you comes up, you might play down the role of these international international human rights mechanisms. And then your other question was about defense commissioner. This is an interesting thing. It's I think it has this good side. When we speak about planning or having common military standards, actually now what we see in Ukraine is that we don't have a similar military standards. We send their equipment which all are different standards, and it's very difficult for Ukraine to handle it. So this is a test case. Or I learned that when France was sending tanks to Ukraine, all the weight limitations of different parts in Germany blocked military traffic on the German roads. So these are just an examples how we are missing a couple of parts maybe in our thinking, and I think it's important that we do that, whether it's both in NATO and in the European structures, that we really plan for the worst case scenarios. How do we help each other if something really bad happens and so forth? And I think there the new Commission could play a role. And then, of course, the interesting issue is that if there comes this kind of defense commissioner or defense industry commissioner, how her or his role is connected to the High Representative of Foreign Policy issues, and who is having really the financial portfolios for different issues. Now, when we, for example, well, it's a quite Orwell-like name, the European Peace Facility, because it's used now for the arms, but who is handling it and who is making the decisions? I think it's a very important how to share the work in the Commission. And as I was advocating the stronger European foreign policy, I think the High Representative should also in the continuation have a very decisive role on that.
Thank you. There's a question over here on the left, Maeve. Thank you. Yes, indeed. Thanks very much.
Thank you, sir, for an enlightening lecture. I have one question, sir. Finland has an international border of 830 odd miles with Russia, and I believe the conscription there is in Finland, and it started in 1920 or so. As an Indian veteran of 1971 war, I find that conscription it makes a lot of friends. I think it's, builds up a lot of camaraderie. I believe Russia has the ability to attack any of the NATO states in a few years' time. So, how well prepared do you think is Finland for that? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Well, we really have a conscription army, and actually we have more than 800,000 people trained for military purposes, and our wartime reserve is active reserve is around 300,000, or a little bit less than 300,000. And for a country with 5.5 million or 5.6 million people, it's quite a big reserve, and it's really based, as you rightly said, on conscription army, and young men serve there 6 months to 1 year, or they can also choose civil service, but either or is obligatory. And now we have women also. It's voluntary to go to the military service. I think around 4% of the military service are women, and we have been keeping our military equipment, so to say, in the good condition. The latest was that we made a decision of 64 F-35 fighters and so forth. So we are also investing to military technologies, and this is, of course, all this was done before our NATO membership. And I think when now our new NATO colleagues are visiting Finland, they are a little bit surprised how functional this our system is, and not only on the military side, but the civil protection side is well planned. We have bomb shelters actually almost for every Finn, even for nuclear war situations. So it's something that we continued after the Second World War, and we had never stopped of doing that. And of course, in these new circumstances, people give a lot of value to both to our capabilities of our military, but also on the civil protection side. These are important to create a certain feeling of security and so forth. If something bad happens, I think when everybody is asking always from the Finns that, are you afraid of Russia? And it's difficult to answer, because I said being afraid is not the right word how you describe your neighbor. We are used to, we have always been in that location geographically. We have a history, unfortunately also sometimes sad history, with wars and conflicts with Russia. We have enjoyed a long time of peace. We are very grateful for that. Peace is definitely what we want to work for. But of course, we are always ready to defend our country. And that's also, when you measure the opinion polls among the Finnish citizens, there's always this question, are you ready to fight for your country if the end result is uncertain? And then huge majority of the Finns are saying yes to this question. So it's I think we are doing our best, of course, to secure our own country, but we do that also to avoid anyone thinking that it would be easy to disturb our peace.
Thank you, Pekka. There's a question from David Finnemore here in the middle, and then the question at the back. Maybe Maeve, if the microphone could go middle across to David. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your lecture and for your responses to questions so far. Two questions for you, and they're related, and they do pick up on something that's been said already. You started your talk by saying that NATO, Finland's succession to NATO does not negate the need for a common European defence, and you've indicated a number of ways in which there may be further defence cooperation. I'm wondering what you envisage the situation being, or what you would like the situation to be in, say, 5 years' time. Because the EU's long had a commitment to a common European defence, but it's only made sort of baby steps in that direction over time, yet it's faced with a major crisis. And in the history of European integration, we know that crisis is often seen as a great opportunity for deeper integration and achieving some of the long-term objectives. So it'd be interesting to know what you envisage seeing or like to see in 5 years' time. But then also, to what extent do you actually think it's going to be achievable? Because you've also picked up on the fact that the EU on a number of issues is divided. And although its initial response to Ukraine was very united, we've since seen a bit of fragmentation coming in. There's not always the unanimity there that we might anticipate. And we know full well that treaty change, which would often be required for further development in terms of defence capacity, is something which member states want to avoid. And also that we've got the Hungarian position at the moment where there's a veto on a lot of issues.
Thanks, David. Pekka.
Good questions. Maybe I start for the later one on what is achievable. Maybe also I was a little bit more skeptical what can be, how the European defense can be organized. But when I'm looking how much we do as European Union for a country that is not member of European Union, Ukraine, that leads me to the question that how much would we do for a European Union member states under attack? And actually, sometimes, it has been people say jokingly that, somebody sends olive oil and somebody sends grain and somebody sends whatever. That's the 42.7 article. But if we look how seriously European countries have been taken the defense of Ukraine, I think we would do the same for Italy or for Malta or for Sweden or for Ireland and so forth. It's actually, it's somehow now even more inbuilt in our thinking when we have done so much for a country that is not a European Union member. And then to the question that what I would like to see happening in 5 years' time during the next Commission or next European election period, I'm thinking that actually, because I don't think that NATO and European Union should overlap on the defense issue so much, but I can see that when we look at the comprehensive security, we need actually everyone. We need the information side, we need the traffic side, we need the civil protection side and so forth. And what I would like to see actually in European Union is planning and training those issues more that are linked to our wider security or comprehensive security, which definitely maybe NATO is not doing at the moment, that where our civilian authorities would plan things together and so forth. Military mobility is one example of that, but there are myriads of topics that are linked to the security, telecommunication and so forth is there, and I think there European Union could have a bigger role. And this of course leads me to think that it's not only the Commissioner for Defence, but it's every sector that could work on those issues.
Thank you. There's a question at the back there, yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You've talked extensively about military, and you've talked extensively about pure diplomacy. And obviously pure diplomacy is better than military, because especially with civilians. But there is a middle ground of trade and of sanctions. We're now heading to the 14th package of sanctions with the EU against Russia. You famously, when you were foreign minister, suggested that there could be sanctions against Brazil whenever they were not tackling the Amazon fires. It was carrot and stick. You said there could be sanctions. We could veto Mercosur, but at the same time, you were suggesting also sending fire appliances. My question is this: where is the threshold for using trade as either a strong arm or as a lever in this diplomacy?
Well, these are interesting questions. That when the sanctions or economic decisions against some country could be used, and of course we have a long history. We have the South Africa history, and we have many other histories, and this is of course something that is now raised in the Middle East issues, and of course we are using it in against Russia at the moment and so forth. I think it's practically, of course, a situation where we can find a consensus on using those, and now how we are using the sanctions against Russia, of course, is that we are trying to cut their military capabilities through these sanctions. So we have a purpose of those issues. And then comes the interesting question that lifting, how do you do the lifting the sanctions, and what is the right decision? Because it's many people think that when you put sanctions, the sanctions will somehow be there forever, or at least we don't give up if somebody else gives up and so forth. But we know that lifting of the sanctions usually is then part of the peace process, or could be part of the peace process. That's when somebody starts to behave, we can then lift the sanctions and so forth. But I think there's not a single rule or easy rule when to use sanctions and when not to use sanctions. Of course, what you were referring to, the issue of can it be used also when the environmental damage is done, and I've been involved in this ecocide debate and so forth, where crime against the nature or crime against biodiversity is happening. Can we put also sanctions in those cases against a country that, for example, is destroying its forests or biodiversity and so forth? I wouldn't exclude that kind of idea either, but of course the way out of the sanctions should be planned at the same time. What are the conditions that the sanctions can then be lifted?
Thank you. There was another question at the back there. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to zoom in, if I could, perhaps on, I suppose, the political and then societal reaction within Finland to joining NATO. I think it's kind of interesting that with your own background as an MP for the Green Party, sort of, traditionally sort of a left, centre-left party, bringing your country into NATO and doing the work you did, bringing them into NATO. Did you find there was much of a reaction or a resistance, perhaps, from the left, from the centre-left, even within your own party, across Finland, with the work that you did, and then eventually sort of acceding into NATO?
Thank you.
Well, there, of course, was debate in the party, in political parties. We had but it was a very unique voting in the parliament in the end. No one from my party and MPs were against. Some of the left-wing alliance members voted against. Of course, when you look backwards, if we have had a right-wing bourgeois government in Finland, would it be so easy to get the Social Democrats on board? Would it be so easy to get the left-wing alliance on board or Greens on board? That's a good question, actually, to go to the history. And did people rely more when center-left government was doing the job? That, okay, this has to be a serious situation when those people who usually speak more about the peace and are not so military minded, so to say, are now looking things so serious. Yes, maybe that could be an analysis afterwards. Or in Sweden, was it easier when the Social Democrats were in the government and they finally decided that let's go for this decision? If it would have been a bourgeois government, would it be easy to get the Social Democrats on board? Of course, all this is speculative, but yes, that certainly had a certain influence. But we still, and I think it's very important at the same time to mention that it's not illegal to resist NATO or be critical towards NATO, because Finns sometimes have this, feeling that let's do everything together and we are all united and so forth. And you have to defend also those who are opposing the idea. And certainly there were some journalists, some intellectuals and so forth who said that this is not so bright idea. I think it's very important that discussion also existed in Finland.
Thank you. There's a question from Peter McLaughlin here. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Ukraine has also triggered a big debate in Ireland about neutrality. Now, it's obviously a debate which is a lot more abstract than Finland and Sweden sharing a border with Russia. But given that how Ukraine and the Ukraine-Russia conflict is, as I understand it, it's seen very differently in other parts of the world, whether that's Africa, Asia, Latin America. Is there still a case for European or Western countries with a non-aligned voice? And I'm thinking particularly of the role maybe that Ireland has played recently with the Middle East, where arguably it was ahead of a lot of other Western countries and has led opinion in certain regards in taking a different stance in what's going on in the Middle East. So is there still a case for countries, and in some ways there are parallels, of course, with Finland and Irish history in certain regards, but to have that role, to be able to speak in a different way that are not important military actors?
No, that's a very good question, and also maybe I approach it from the perspective that we are very often blamed for double standards in a way that when we are very concerned about human rights and violations against the international law in Ukraine, are we working for the same norms and same values also in other conflicts like Middle East or on African conflicts and so forth. And there I think we really need a mirror sometimes when we speak about the Western Europe or EU countries and so forth, that yes, Ukrainian crisis is closer to us. That explains why it's easier to follow, easier to form an opinion. But I am concerned that we look with the different criteria, different conflicts, and that's why, for example, when I'm working actively with the African counterparts and meet regularly African ministers and decision makers or activists. I think they have a point there that we might have different criteria on different conflicts, and that's something that we should be concerned. Then to the question that is there role for the non-allied countries in the world and so forth. I think yes, there is, but of course we have many. We have India, we have Serbia, we have so it's countries can define their roles in quite different ways. So I don't know if that kind of movement of non-allied that was during the Cold War could function in that sense anymore. I always love my counterparts debate in Sudan when they said, I think it was that time foreign minister who said to me that we really missed the Cold War. That was a great time. And I asked that, what was so great during the Cold War time? And he said, look, we went to Washington and we negotiated, but we didn't get a really good offer. Then we went to Moscow and they gave a little bit better, and then Washington woke up. So we could put the East and West to compete, who has a bigger solidarity towards Africa. And then when the Cold War ended, Americans disappeared, Russians disappeared, but luckily Chinese stayed. So we had China there. And then I had a question, continued with China. What is the elevator speech that China has for you here in Sudan? And they said it's very simple. First they say that we said to China that you cannot cope with the population growth during the 1970s, so you cannot do anything to that. But look what we have done with the population growth, we have managed it. If you have here in Africa any problem with the population growth, we have a model in China. And then during the 1990s, people said to China that you are doomed to the bad economy, your economy will never grow. But look, we have this yearly 5 to 7% growth. So if you have any economic problems here in Africa, we have a model in China. And now people say to us in China that you cannot cope with the environmental problems. But look, we have the cheapest wind turbines and good solar panels for you here in Africa. If you have any environmental problems here in Africa, China has a solution. And then the minister turned to me that is a Chinese elevator speech. What's your offer? What Europe can offer? And that's a good question to us.
Thank you. We have time for one final question. There's a question here. Yeah, here it is. Thank you very much. Thanks very much.
I'm not hearing a lot of hope. If I'm picking you up right, it's effectively saying Europe should be on a war footing. Putin's not going to negotiate. China, parts of Russia as well, are taking over Africa. We'll take our eye off Taiwan, and there's nothing we can do about it. Is that it? There's no real role for diplomacy, even unaligned. I haven't heard mediation once. It's sounding very bleak, and it's sounding like if Putin wins, it's going to get bleaker. But maybe I've picked you up wrongly. So.
Thank you.
Well, that's quite a big question, and maybe I refer to when there was a memorial service for President Ahtisaari, and our that time Undersecretary of State, Mr. Kai Sauer, wanted to conclude what was the Ahtisaari's legacy or what was his message, and he said that there were 4 points always when Ahtisaari was negotiating. And first issue was that you have to have a client, because if there's no wish to have a peace, then there's no way to negotiate. And we are still looking for the clients in some parts of the world, as you know. And then secondly, there has to be a model. In Namibia, it was the independence and end of colonialism. In Kosovo, getting rid of Serbian dominance. In Aceh, autonomous model where the Åland Island model, for example, was used. So you have to have a model. How do you solve the problem? And then the third is that don't do that alone. Use international bodies, UN agencies, NATO, EU, whoever, as a subcontractor. Keep it in your hands, the process, but let others to do what they can do. You don't have to do everything for the peace alone. And then the fourth lesson was that don't leave the peace processes unwatched. So come back to the issue, look regularly what can be corrected and so forth. So there has to be a follow-up of the peace process. With these 4 issues, you can solve the peace in the world.
When we get to solving peace in the world, it's time to bring things to an end. It is, in fact, time to bring things to an end. And we've worked our speaker very hard. Thank you to the audience for a wide range of questions which have made it a stimulating discussion. I'm very grateful to Professor Elborn for his comments earlier on, and to Morris and Maeve and Brett and Wendy Louise for the logistical work that was put into organising the lecture. There is hope in there, in what you've been saying, I think. I think you've been talking about things not being inevitable, about partnership, about the importance of the inheritance of what we know about diplomacy and mediation, about the fact that things which can seem bleak can then turn out not necessarily to be as bleak, because things we don't anticipate can come. Things we don't anticipate can make it worse, but they can sometimes make things better as well. And I suppose the contingency of our shared future is something which means that we all have to keep working to try to produce the most peaceful, the most avoidant of human misery situations that we can produce. And I think you've given us a lot of rich thought for that. So for a very wide-ranging lecture, for excellent answers to questions, please join me in thanking our 2024 Harri Holkeri Lecturer, Pekka Haavisto.
Thank you.